Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest episode of the Adopt 365 podcast. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to us on YouTube or your favorite podcast application to make sure you get the latest episodes of the Adopt 365 podcast on whichever platform suits you. I'd like to introduce my co-host Megan Warren and Anthony Charman.
Hi.
Hello, both. How are you?
All good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, all good. Thank you very much. Looking forward to today's topic. So today's topic is all around your files and Microsoft 365. With inside Microsoft 365, there are a number of different file storage options. And typically when companies are in the process of adopting or onboarding Microsoft 365, you'll find that files end up appearing in a multitude of different scenarios. So in today's podcast, we'll be looking to just review all the options you have for storing your files inside Microsoft 365, give our tips and recommendations for how we recommend each of those locations are utilized, and then also just look into some of the tools and utilities available to you to help you find files, organize files, and just be generally productive with your files in Microsoft 365. But as usual, before we get stuck into the main content, first of all, we'll do a round the room, around the presenters in the podcast, and just find out what you've been working on or what's been standing out to you in the last month. So, Anthony, first of all, over to you.
So yeah, new stuff in Teams. The main function that I've been waiting for a long time has been this ability to not have to look at myself all the time when I'm on a Teams call. So now there is a function called Hide Me that will enable me to turn off me seeing myself on the screen as I'm talking to other people, which I've just found very, very useful. Easily accessible by just right-clicking on the image of yourself and hitting the Hide Me button. It just slides the image of yourself out of the way and makes it a lot easier, so you're not distracted about what's going on with your face as you're saying things. And I just find that very, very useful.
Fantastic. So the standout thing for me is something we've spoken about, I think, multiple times. I think it was probably announced at Microsoft Ignite last year, and it's a feature called Shared Channels in Microsoft Teams. Now, those of you may know when you share a Microsoft Teams channel with an external party, today the experience isn't as maybe slick as it could be for the joining party. They have to go to the top right and switch between the different tenants to view the channels inside your tenant rather than viewing it inside their tenant like it is another Teams channel. Now that's all changing with shared channels. You will be able to see channels that have been shared with you in the specific way of shared channels alongside all your other channels inside Microsoft Teams. So this is really good news. It's coming out now. I believe it's in some form of public beta release. There is a configuration to it because of the nature of what needs to happen behind the scenes with the Azure Active Directory Trust. Both organizations need to set up effectively a trust to say that they're allowing shared channels to work inside the tenants. So this will be mostly used by organizations that you work and collaborate with on a regular basis, and will have to, for most champions, involve your IT team getting this set up and working for you. So we're playing with it now. It appeared in our tenant this morning. We're looking to get some hands-on experience with this ASAP. Would really be interested in the listeners. Comment down below or reach us on social media and let us know what use cases you've got, have you set it up, and what are your first experiences with shared channels. Megan, what has stand out for you?
Well, firstly, before I go into my standout thing, I definitely won't be using Hide Me. I love being able to see myself in the Teams meeting. But my standout thing at the moment is probably leading in quite nicely to this conversation today, but it is using metadata in SharePoint. So within the team, within the files there, having that extra column of data, which for my files and in my team, we've got set to our status, just allows us to add what is just a small bit of data to that, but allows us to be so much more organized, to keep everyone up to date without having to send emails or check in and stuff like that. So setting up metadata, using it on your files, which through SharePoint, but in Teams, is really useful, and we'll go into a lot more detail, but I've really enjoyed using it recently.
There was one more thing I was going to mention in things I found really useful recently, and it's very relevant to today's podcast, and that is that if you're using the SharePoint migration tools, there's now a discovery mode there. So before, you kind of used to get some idea of the length of the amount of data that was going to be moved based on the filters you put in place. You can now in effect do a trial migration, which will come up and give you the figures, give you some idea of the length of time it's going to take. And I found that really useful in planning migrations from on-premise data into SharePoint and into the Teams environment. So yeah, very relevant to today and what we're going to be talking about.
Definitely, yeah, as you say, very relevant. So as we get on to the main part of today's podcast, then just to kind of review where we are. So most organizations by now are already utilizing Microsoft 365 in some way, shape or form. And there are a number of different utilities available in Microsoft 365 that are designed to store files. And this is where we find confusion can easily occur. Typically, when your data is in a standard solution, what we would call on premises, you will have files in network shares. So when you go into My Computer, you might have things like an S drive or a T drive. You might have a personal home directory, which is often set as the H drive. You'll have My Documents. You might have files all over your desktop. You end up with files in a number of different scenarios, normally set up in such a way so you can work with your documents personally, but also work with documents that belong to specific departments or specific areas of the business. When looking to move over to Microsoft 365, then you've got options including OneDrive, you've got Teams channels, we've got SharePoint repositories, as well as other areas that also accept files like Microsoft Lists and even Planner. You're able to attach files to that. So what we're hoping to do today is just demystify a little bit the file options available in Microsoft 365, discuss how we see them being utilized, and maybe have a bit of a discussion as to how the process of transferring or deciding where your files will go from traditional IT solutions to the modern Microsoft 365 experience. So to get us started with this subject, let's start with something close to all of us, and that's our individual files, the files that we typically keep in My Computer or maybe on a H drive inside a corporate environment. Megan, do you want to run us through OneDrive? What is it? How you recommend it's utilized?
Yeah, definitely. So, as you mentioned, OneDrive is definitely for your individual files. I heard someone say it the other day, and why I hadn't noticed it myself, but the word one is literally in the name, so it is for those documents that you are working on an individual basis. You as the one, and yeah, someone said it, and I was like, wow, I've never twigged that before, but it makes so much sense. So OneDrive definitely is for those individual files that you're working on. You do have the ability to share files via OneDrive. The features and the sort of functionality of being able to share via OneDrive are incredibly useful. But it should really be on that ad hoc basis where you haven't got a team, a channel, a full project thing going on, where you just need to share it on an ad hoc basis, on a one-off basis with maybe one or a few people there. One of the best things about OneDrive as well is the ability to access it no matter where you are. So you've got it in three key ways that you can access it. So you have it on your desktop, on your main laptop that you have, so on a work laptop or something like that, where the files can either be stored in the cloud or you can choose to keep them on that device so you can access them at all times. That's sort of your main way that you're going to access them. But there are always times you're going to pick up a different device or you're not going to be able to access them on your desktop. So you've got the browser version as well, heading over to office.com and accessing them there. But probably my favorite way to access them is on mobile as well, purely because never before have you been able to access your files and edit them whilst you're on the go, on a tablet, on a mobile device. You can do all of that now. So you've got the three ways to access it, and across all of them, everything syncs simultaneously and is just magic behind the scenes, because I can drop my laptop and forget that I'm working on that and then pick up my tablet and then carry on exactly where I left off without any issues, which is incredible. But the only thing that I'd probably mention around OneDrive is when you are sharing files with people, whilst it is for that one use case, if you are sharing them, just make sure you're changing the access that you're sharing it with. Don't do the default one, which is just anybody with the link can access it, because it's not secure and if the wrong person got their hands on it, they'd still be able to access it. So I'd love to see Microsoft changing the default to only specific people rather than the default being anyone. But just make sure you go and change that, set passwords, set expiry dates if you need to. But yeah, OneDrive is incredible for your individual files because of the ability to access it across any device at any time.
Definitely. And I think what we often see is we see maybe IT taking charge of a migration of the files from your home directory or My Computer into OneDrive. So you can have that continuity of the ways that maybe you used to work to the way that you work today. I like what you were saying there, Megan, about the one in OneDrive, about the individual, about you, with the options to ad hoc sharing if that works. Then before we then segue onto the Microsoft Teams side of thing, and the clue is in the name, working with Teams, maybe if we want to take that literally. Megan, could you just talk about how OneDrive and Microsoft Teams come together? There's a couple of integration points between Teams and OneDrive.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So whilst I said there was the 3 keys to access it, there's probably actually 5 now that we're introducing Teams into OneDrive and OneDrive into Teams. So in Teams, when you're in the interface, on the left-hand side where you have activity, Teams, chat, and all of that, if you click the ellipsis that's there, you can open up files, and that actually has your OneDrive storage in it, which you can access all your files in OneDrive. And if they're a Office-based application as well, you can actually open them in Teams and start editing them directly in Teams, and then it will automatically save there as well. So you can access all your OneDrive files in Teams. And the other way is via chat. So when you share a file with somebody via a chat message in Microsoft Teams chat, that actually saves it into OneDrive rather than SharePoint. I believe it saves it into the person who shared its OneDrive, and at the top of that chat message you have a tab that's called Files. Both of you can go in there and access that file in the future and edit it if you are using an Office application again. And also you can access that if you go into your files within OneDrive, you'll have a folder that's called Microsoft Teams chat files. Again, you can open them up, you can access them. So you have it in those 2 different ways in Microsoft Teams, via chat when you've shared it with somebody, or just your own OneDrive, which you can access and edit as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So yeah, really clear understanding there as to what OneDrive would be used for. What I think we often see inside organizations is OneDrive is one of the first file storage locations that is rolled out as part of Microsoft 365. And sometimes, maybe incorrectly, and we'll come on to this, you see people setting up folders and sharing those with their colleagues as a replacement to their team drive, their network drive that they would normally use for their team or their project or things like that. So Anthony, over to you, I suppose, and Microsoft Teams and those types of files that you might want to be working on with others. Do you want to run us through the file storage options inside Microsoft Teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very valid point what you just said there, Barry, and it goes back to a kind of fundamental point that I come across with organisations quite often, in that when I say to them, "Are you using Microsoft Teams?" they say yes, but what they actually mean is that they've implemented it, under the pressure of home working and things like that, mainly around using chat and around using the OneDrive and things of that nature. And they are, and they're also using that for meetings plannings and things like meeting planning. What they don't mean is that they've actually started to use the Teams within Teams, and why Microsoft called the whole product Teams and then called an element of it Teams, I do not know. But Teams within Microsoft Teams is an area which is there to support communication and collaboration within your team, within an organization. And that could be a departmental team. That is usually where we start with an adoption, or it could be a project team, a kind of cross-organizational project with people from different departments all working together. And it gives us lots of things we can do. We can create a team for a department. And if you notice, when you create a team, you and go into the team, there are lots of tabs related to that department, and we have the ability to create channels for the different activities that go on within that department. Now, on each of the tabs within a channel, we've got a Files tab, and that really is the place where we should be locating the files related to that activity, that channel's activities within that department. Sorry, that's a bit confusing, but that's where those files should be. Traditionally, we've held those back in the server room. In the pre-cloud era, we've held them in the server room. We've had a departmental file share, and everything's just piled into there. Now we've got the option within a departmental team to create a number of channels and then segregate the files into those activities. So it's almost like an automatic, I would say it's an automatic filing system. The files related to that particular activity in the channel within that departmental team are the ones that are relevant to there. They're the drawer in the filing cabinet that stores the documents that are related to that activity. So that is in that files tab. And one of the real challenges we have when we look at an organization and we start to look at migrating files from their on-premises departmental shares is deciding where they need to go. I mean, the destination for those is really the files tab on the channel within the team that is related to that activity, and that's where we need them to be so that we can communicate and collaborate on those files effectively. So that's the challenge that we have. That's where they really should be, and that's where they're most relevant to and easiest to work for that and find for that activity in the department. Sorry, I think I've said the word teams, department, channels in various different ways there, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got multiple teams from multiple groups of people coming together, and then the channels to help you subdivide the files inside of those teams, each of those with their own file option. Megan, I'm just going to come to you just from your point as a Microsoft trainer. Obviously, once you start putting files into a Microsoft Teams or into a channel specifically, there's a number of features that then become enabled for sharing and collaboration. I don't know if you just want to talk about some of those features that are available in Teams or that are enabled by the time you then put them into Teams channels.
Yeah, definitely. So the biggest thing that you can probably talk about when we're saving the files in a channel in a team is the co-authoring functionality. So anybody in that team can click on that file, open it up in multiple different formats, which I'll talk about in a moment, and you can all edit it at the same time. So gone are the days where you used to get locked out, and I remember people shouting across the office saying, "Oh, Barry, are you in this file? Can you go out? I need to edit it quickly." They're no longer a problem, and you don't have the issue where somebody's emailing it out. Everyone makes their changes, and then you've got to try and consolidate them into one document as well. So that's probably the biggest thing that it has changed, the fact that everyone can co-author it. But there's a couple other features that come with it. One that I mentioned a moment ago, when you have a file saved in your team, if it's a Word document, Excel, PowerPoint, or anything like that, when you click on it, you can have a default as to how it can open, because you can either open it up inside the Teams interface, you can open it up in the full desktop application, or you can open it up in the browser version as well. All of them are perfectly good to use. The one in Teams is potentially less feature rich than the full desktop option, but it's really up to you as to what you use there. But all I recommend is just clicking on it in the files and setting your default. So you can say open and then set your default as to the desktop, into Teams, or in the browser version as well. And then probably my last feature that I cover around files in Teams is the conversation tab that you get when you open that document up in Teams. So what you have when you open up the document in Teams, Word document, for example, in the top right-hand corner, you have a tab called Conversation, or a button called Conversation. When you open that up, on the right-hand side, there's a banner that appears, and you can have a conversation with the team about that file. You can tag people in it, you can give them updates on it. And it just means that all that conversation is in context with that document, because it's stored alongside the document. If you mention people and say, "Can you update this page?" it takes them straight to that document. They know exactly what you're talking about. And then you haven't got the file saved in Teams and then the conversation happening in email or chat where it doesn't link up. It all comes together to be saved into that one location, giving it a lot more context, and my favorite word, makes everything a lot more productive.
So, thank you for that, Megan. So, Anthony, to kind of bring together the last two things we've spoken about. So, obviously, we started with OneDrive for personal files. We've moved on to now Teams, and next place we're going to is SharePoint. Maybe, Anthony, could you just discuss the option that you've got around syncing your files and how the syncing your files works inside Microsoft Teams?
So syncing our files, one of the challenges we have, and I think we might come on to this in a minute, is finding files. And one of the most familiar ways in which we find files, and which has been there for years, ever since we had Windows 95, has been File Explorer or Windows Explorer, and that enables us to go and look at our file structure and find those files. When we bring them into the Teams environment, it's not, at the moment, it's not so easy to find those files. And it's not a familiar way for many people to work. So we do have the option to use the sync client, though it's called the OneDrive sync client or the SharePoint sync client, to bring files from Teams, from the kind of the cloud storage that they're in within Teams, back into our desktop devices in a very familiar way, so we can get them to appear within Windows Explorer. So when we go into Teams, we've got the option to sync those files, and if we hit that button, then those files are in effect synchronized in the same way as OneDrive is back to our actual PC. So a cache of those files, whichever ones we choose, will be put onto our PC, and we can search those in a similar way to we would before. One of the real benefits there, and I know that this is something we did within Computer World when we brought all of our client data across into Teams, we were very, very familiar with just kind of typing the first three letters of a client's name and Windows Explorer taking us to that client's folder. We're not able to do that within Teams, so it made it very usable for people, for us to take that client directory and sync it back to our PC. And what it does is, in effect, it brings back stubs, kind of stubs of the data there. The information still stays in the cloud, but if we click on that, it will download that file and make it available to us. Or if we know we're going to be working offline for some time, if we're not going to have an internet connection, we can go into Explorer and right-click and say we want these files actually available on our device. So yeah, a very easy way to keep the user experience the same, even though those files have actually moved from our on-premises storage into Microsoft's cloud.
I think on top of the benefit it brings when you're trying to search for files, Anthony, something I've done recently is I've synchronized some of my team files into my OneDrive, because there were applications I was working on, such as InDesign, that when you click on Save As, you don't get the option to go into your site. Like you do Word, when you click Save As, it goes to Sites, and then you can save it directly into SharePoint. I couldn't do that in like InDesign or Photoshop or anything like that I use in marketing. And what I found myself doing was almost saving it to my OneDrive to then go and copy it to save into my team, which made absolutely no sense, because then I was just duplicating my effort. So synchronizing that team file to my OneDrive now means that when I go file save as in something like InDesign, it brings up my file directory, and then I've got those folders and those files, and I can save it directly in there. So as well as the searching capability, that's made my life a lot easier when I'm trying to search, save documents that aren't necessarily Office documents and don't have that site saving functionality built in.
So there's a word of warning here, though. I mean, there's two things to think here, and it's not my usual rant about chaos. But if we were to take all of our client files and pick those up and move them into our Teams environment, say I just move those into the general tab of a team, and then I try and use the sync client to bring all of that to every one of my users. If we've got, I think the limit that Microsoft say is about 300,000 files, but in reality, it's a lot less than that, because we just get a big performance hit, because it's constantly looking to synchronize those files. So if I was to take all of our client directories and try and synchronize them to everyone within Computer World, then the performance of that would be terrible. When it goes back to try and resync a file that I've modified here back to the cloud storage, it takes a lot of time, and I've seen kind of delays of up to 15 minutes before it actually gets back to synchronize it back to the cloud version. So don't just put everything from your on-premises storage into one, into a team, into the general channel, keep all the file structure there, then sync that to every user, because you just won't see the performance that you need and the performance you expect. So that's why when we do a file migration, there's a lot of planning involved in that. The first thing to do is don't synchronize everything you've got on your on-premises store, because most of that will probably be of no use to anyone, because it's so old that it really needs to be cleaned up or just deleted. Because one, you're backing up lots of data, and secondly, that that's from a GDPR point of view, it's a liability you don't need to have, because we usually don't need to store files back to 20 odd years ago. Did I say there was two things? Because I can't remember what the second was now. But yeah, just put the data where it's relevant. Use the filing cabinet in effect within Teams to break that data into chunks and put the relevant data into the relevant channel within the relevant team.
Brilliant, thank you. So I suppose now it's over to me. So we've spoken about your personal files in OneDrive. We've spoken about your team or project files being stored in Teams channels. We've spoken about how the OneDrive client actually can be used to sync those Microsoft, the files that are in the Microsoft Teams channels down to your computer for flexibility, for offline working. So where does SharePoint come into all of this? We seem to have covered a vast majority of file types that we'll be utilizing. And SharePoint is often the time, place where we'll end up with the most confusion. Well, hold on a minute. I've got OneDrive, I've got Teams. Why do I need SharePoint? What is SharePoint, and how does it get involved with this? Now, maybe some of the techies watching this will go, well, come on, Barry, we know all of this. But what we do find quite often is champions and users may struggle with the relationship between all of these tools. Now, ultimately, SharePoint is an application that has been around for quite a long time. It allows you to create web pages or sites. It also allows you to store files. Now, inside SharePoint, you have a site, and inside a site, you can have different applications that allow you to either create pages or file repositories inside of it. Now, the relationship between OneDrive and SharePoint is actually the technology that runs OneDrive. It is behind the scenes, but you never see that relationship. That relationship is never really visible to the user and barely visible to the administrator. It is just the technology that makes that work. When it comes to Microsoft Teams, every time a new team is created, a new SharePoint site is created behind the scenes. And that SharePoint site is called a team site. If you desire, you can modify the default page that is created and have a bit of maybe a departmental intranet. You can add that as a tab in your Microsoft Teams channel if you desire. And you could add it as a link to your main intranet to allow people to maybe come through to a marketing or a sales intranet or something like that. But also inside of there, so by default, when you create a Microsoft team, you will get a general channel created by default. That general channel will have a file location in it. Those files are stored within the repository in that site that is created. So even though that you're viewing them inside Microsoft Teams, you're viewing them in the Files tab inside your channel, they are actually stored in a folder inside that SharePoint site that is created. And then for each additional channel that you create inside of that team, an additional folder is created. So there's two ways that you can go and see what's going on with this. You can go into Microsoft Teams, you can pick any of your channels and click Open in SharePoint at the top, and you'll be taken to the SharePoint site with the file repository where your files are located. And if you use the navigation on the page that you're taken to, you'll be able to go up a level and see all the different channels that may be available to you. So it might be a general channel, it might be a projects channel, whatever the channels you have inside Microsoft Teams. So that is how inside Microsoft Teams that SharePoint is the tool that is powering the file storage and a number of other things such as permissions inside Microsoft Teams. The ability to sync that we spoke about in with OneDrive, we can also do that directly from SharePoint. You could also go to your company SharePoint site by going to office.com, clicking the waffle in the top left-hand side and selecting SharePoint. You'll then be given a view of your most recently used SharePoint sites, or you can choose to view all your SharePoint sites, and you will see a SharePoint site that has been created for every single Microsoft team that has been created inside your organization. You may see some additional ones as well, because you can create SharePoint sites on their own, such as maybe your intranet and other things. So that is the relationship between Microsoft Teams and SharePoint. But that maybe isn't where it ends. There are other things that you can choose to do with SharePoint. So a good example might be if you have an organization that has process and procedure documents. There may be no need to have a team for that. It's not something that's up for debate, that is up for conversation, that has collaboration needs around it. It's somewhere you want to be able to store files so people can go and view them because they're important to your organization. So you can actually, as I just mentioned, go to SharePoint from the office.com waffle, select SharePoint and create a new SharePoint site. Inside of there, you'll get a default file repository created and you can store files directly there. Why this can be good is you could then link to it from your intranet. It could be your intranet, but you're also able to create multiple file repositories. So if you want different sets of files shared with different people, we can actually have different sets of permission associated with them. We can also do something that Megan alluded to earlier, is add additional metadata to it. So what does this actually mean? This means that when the files are saved, not only are they just saved with who saved it and the date and time, you could choose to add other different characteristics to it that allows you to categorize and help find those documents. So it could be something like which department it belongs to. It could be when is the next review date for that document. It could be who is the ultimate owner of that document, that procedure, that policy for your organization. Now, these can be quite complex things to set up, but if you have specific needs in your organization, speak to your IT department or come to speak to someone like Computerworld, and we can advise the best way to architect the file solution for these more complex use cases that aren't just team storage, file storage locations. So SharePoint is very large. It is a massive repository with a number of different features and functionality. But the thing to take away from this podcast is it is what is powering the file element inside your team site. And there are additional options that if you have files that you want to store in a centralized location outside of Teams, you're also able to create file storage locations directly in SharePoint. Anthony, Megan, from a pure SharePoint perspective, is there anything extra that you think we should be adding?
So I think if you have taken your data and some organizations are already using SharePoint quite extensively within their organization and got a lot of knowledge stored in a SharePoint repository, it is possible to link that back to a team. So when you're in the Teams Files tab, in a Teams channel in the Files tab, you can add cloud storage. So that's an option there which allows you to do two things. It allows you to link to an existing SharePoint repository, so you can bring the data in from there into your Files tab, so it's in a kind of a relevant place. But you can also bring stuff in coincidentally from other cloud storage options like Dropbox, etc., Google Drive. So if you had an investment in data that was stored in a Google Drive, you can bring it into your channel, so it's there in a place where you can communicate and collaborate around it. So yeah, that's another way, if you've already got an investment in SharePoint, that you can bring that into the Teams environment. The other thing I was going to say is that I find that a lot of users are just not confused by SharePoint, but see that, oh, there's a SharePoint button there, I can open it in SharePoint. I just wish there was a way to turn that off, because it adds more confusion to a lot of people. So yeah, I just wish Microsoft would put a button there going like, don't mention that SharePoint is the database and the repository and the document storage mechanism that sits behind Teams, because people go and find that button, press that button, and then show a whole different world of file repositories and intranets and things like that. Megan, have you got anything to add around that?
I don't think so. I think you guys have covered quite a lot there, and I do think Anthony's right in that it's a lot to get your head around when you're introducing Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, and they all come together in some way, but they are all their separate entities. So just understanding OneDrive and Teams for those files, and then SharePoint sort of on top of that as a additional thing. Yeah, it's a lot to get your head around, but hopefully it makes sense, especially after listening to this episode of the podcast.
So before we move on to the next bit, try and simplify it as much as possible. OneDrive is where you can store your personal files. You can share if you really need to on an ad hoc basis, but if you want to be working on it regularly with more people or sharing it with people, or it's part of a team, it really should live inside the Files tab inside a channel inside the relevant team. So from a user's perspective, it's either in OneDrive or in the channels inside the relevant team. We then have SharePoint, and SharePoint powers the Teams file functionality and can be used for advanced file storage requirements inside your organization. Users are most likely to see those via the intranet and by selecting specific links to view specific types of files. But that is the brief summary of how a user's eye view would see this. If you are an .365 subscriber, and those that aren't, please reach out to us at Computer World. We have a whole training platform around Microsoft 365. We actually have a set of learning materials that go through your options. That I think we also cover OneDrive in there, and we cover SharePoint in there. So we've got lots of information that is available. It's very affordable. Your users can easily log in with their work credentials. There's no need to have a different set of credentials, and there's hundreds of articles and videos in there that break all these kind of concepts down. If you're already a member, make sure you go and check these out, as well as the other podcasts that you'll find in there as well, and don't miss the live training every month. Anthony, I think it was yesterday, did a piece of training around this very subject as well, so make sure that you've looked at those options. So we've covered the file storage options then, but we then kind of get to two other things. So I'm actually just going to change the order a little bit and come to you first here, Megan. So you've already mentioned some things about sharing, but what are your recommendations around what not to do, and then how to share your files if you want to be sharing files in both OneDrive and Teams channels?
Yeah, so what not to do, the first thing that I would say is do not send it as an attachment to an email, because at that point they will download it, they will open it up, and if you've edited it in that time that they have then accessed it, it will be a different version. If they edit it, you won't have their edits, so you have to try and consolidate those. So if you are sending it with an email with it, make sure you attach it as a copy rather than attach as, or I may have got that wording wrong. I can't remember off the top of my head now. But when you had it on an email, you can either sort of attach it or you can add it as a copy, which in that sense it is sharing via OneDrive. Link. Yes, as a link. So it was shared via OneDrive, so then you can both edit it in that way. So don't just attach it to emails, because it isn't going to allow that collaboration, and you won't be able to update it together. In terms of sharing, my main thing when we're talking about sharing via OneDrive is just making sure that you have those settings correct. So not just going with the default that shares it with everybody. Click into that, share it with specific people, share it with only your organization, whatever that needs to be. And then you also have those additional options as well around expiry dates, setting passwords, not allowing people to edit, not allowing them to download so they can just view it online. All of those options are there for the right use cases. So if you need them, I really recommend using them as well.
One of the things I've noticed in there, Megs, is there's it's a useful exercise, is there's a sharing report available. So you can, when you look in your OneDrive, see the items that have been shared with someone, because they come up with a little person next to them. But there's also in the OneDrive client, there's a sharing report which will just give you a quick list of all the files you have shared, because it's good discipline just to go back and revoke that share from stuff that's no longer relevant for those people to have access to.
Definitely. Yeah, so that's probably everything when it comes to OneDrive. Just be more disciplined than what we've probably used to being before. In terms of Teams, realistically, you will probably have everyone in that team that needs to access that file because they will be accessing it and will be part of that wider project or department. However, you do have the ability within Teams to still share files with other people that aren't or don't have access to that team. So if it's stored in that team, you do have the option to share it. Whether that will be so relevant moving forward when we've got shared channels, I don't know, because it may be that you just invite that person into that channel, but it may be that you have a file stored in Teams on an ad hoc that you don't want to invite them into the whole channel, you just want to share that file. So you can do that as well via Teams.
Fantastic. So lots of good sharing options and tips there, which brings me, I think, to the last subject, which is finding your files. What we do see is quite often people will make use of the features and functionalities that are available. Maybe a file has been shared with you via OneDrive. Maybe you're using multiple channels to save your files. Maybe you've got some files in SharePoint. Maybe you've got some files in your OneDrive. Maybe some files have been shared with you via emails. We have a multitude of options that are available. Now, first of all, if you've followed our recommendations and you have strict processes, guidance on where your files should be, hopefully they will be easier to find. However, certainly for me in this kind of more cloud world, searching for your files has become a really common way to access a file. So first of all, I recommend meaningfully naming the files that you create. Make sure they're not too long in the names, but make sure that you add a little bit of context as to what the file is about. So rather than just calling something, I don't know, meeting notes, bad example, because you probably use OneNote or something like that. Make sure you call it meeting notes with customer on this date. Just make sure you've got that context. So when you're searching, you're able to kind of add a piece of metadata that you could identify the document without having to open it. Now, Microsoft use something called the graph, which effectively allows you to search across everything that is stored in Microsoft 365. And the best way to access the search functionality is office.com. So if you go to office.com, or if you click the start button and type Office and open the Office application, from there you will see a search bar. It looks identical on both, where you can search for objects that are in files that are in Microsoft 365 across all of those locations, apart from the email side of things. You will also see an updated version of that coming out soon, where there will be a always scrolling, or I forget what the terminology is, but a continuously scrolling list of the files that you've opened and when you opened them. You'll also be able to add templates to that and other things. So I believe that features and functionality is due to come out in Q2, but should be there as well. And that's the most common way that I will go to find a file, irrespective of where it is. I find that it does work better than even going into Word and searching inside Word for your files or something like that. Now, if you're really struggling to find a file, you do have another option. So if you go to the Bing search engine and make sure that you've signed into that search engine, you can also, so sign in with your work details, you can also search for your files in that location as well. And when you do that, in addition to searching across all those file locations, it will also search your email conversations and your messages in Teams as well. So this is a really good location if you're having to do a bit of kind of a look around, trying to find a file that is available to you. I don't know, Megan, Anthony, if you've got any other tips in terms of finding your files, accessing your files at all?
Certainly, I've been using in the top search bar of Teams. If you just type /files, then you've got the opportunity to search in there, and it will come back and it will categorize those by you're searching for a person, you're searching for a file, etc. So I've used that successfully. I'm still a bit of a Windows Explorer person when it comes to searching for files. I've always had quite a discipline around file folder structures. And namings and dates for there, which is good. But yes, I've more recently, you just kind of think, well, where have I put that? Was it in a conversation with someone? Was it in this team or was it in that team that team post would have taken place? So the team search functionality is very good, and I think there are some other operators in there as well that you can use to refine your search and search in different ways. Megan.
So I'm very much like you, Barry. I use office.com or the Office application to find my files. What I have started doing recently is I seem to be working on a number of files at the same time, and then I stop working on them, and then I work on the next lot. So whilst I am working on them, what I am doing when I'm in that document, whether that be Word or whatever, is just pinning them in Word. Then when you go File and Open, you've got your pinned ones there. So whilst I may not have worked it on, I don't know, 2 weeks or so, it will be under those pinned ones there. So just having a bit of structure, but then also remembering to go and unpin them, because otherwise you're just going to have a long list of pinned files. I have found that really useful recently. And when you are searching in office.com or even in Teams, just using those filters. So in Teams, especially if I'm looking for a file and I know I've worked on it with Anthony, I can say who else has edited it. I can say when or what team it was in, if it was in team or chat and everything like that as well. So the filtering with Microsoft Search as well is getting a lot better, because it really is starting to allow you to drill down to specifics to find the file you're looking for.
Definitely. Thank you ever so much, Megan and Anthony. Hopefully everyone that has listened has managed to take something away from this. Organizing your files and migrating them into Microsoft 365 is a big challenge for most companies. Of course, if we can ever be of assistance to this, please reach out to us. More than happy to help and advise you with how to tackle this challenge. But hopefully for those that are independent and happy to do this themselves, this podcast has helped you gain that clarity on what the recommendations are and how the different file structures inside Microsoft 365 hang together. Once again, if you're not already subscribed to the podcast or the YouTube channel, please go and do it. It really does make the difference to us. Make sure you give the video or the podcast a like, and please give us some comments. It's really good to hear what your feedback is, what you're doing, or even suggestions about what you would like in a future Adopt 365 podcast. So that's all that we've got for today. We'll be back next month with more exciting content about Microsoft 365, but thank you for joining us on today's podcast.
Thank you.